If we believe that we're centering the value of equity, we will make mistakes in our time together. How can we extend grace to each other so that it can sort of lubricate the machinations of collective action?
And you have to believe that if people do the work, they can see the world differently. They can build better, stronger, more authentic connections. And that is why we talk about DIG.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tarryn MacCarthy. Today, we have a phenomenal day for you. I have two incredible powerhouse women here. Dr. Tina Opie is an associate professor of management at Babson College. She's the founder of the Opie Consulting Group, and she has worked with huge financial services, entertainment, media, beauty, educational, and healthcare industries. She's also a regular commentator on Harvard Business Review's Women at Work podcast and the Greater Boston NPR affiliate television station WGBH. And Dr. Beth Livingston, also an associate professor in management and entrepreneurship at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business. And she also has a phenomenal background in speaking and consulting for huge companies and nonprofits. And her research has been primarily in gender diversity and the management of work and family, and specifically highlighted in New York Times, Harvard Business Review, NPR. We're talking about some incredible women here today, and they are joining me today because they wrote this incredible book, my friends, Shared Sisterhood: How to Take Collective Action for Racial and Gender Equity at Work. Welcome, Tina and Beth.
Thank you so
Thank
much for having
you,
me.
Taryn. We're excited to be here.
I'm so excited for you guys to be here, and I'm so grateful to you for sending me this book. I got it before everyone else did. I got one of the previews, so thank you. I feel super special.
I can't wait. It's so exciting to see it in people's hands. Tina, I don't know how you feel about that, but it's something else to see it out there in the world.
Yeah, it's a bit surreal because
I
as
can
we've talked about, it's sort of like birthing a baby, and it's been in our womb, our collective womb, for so long, and now it's out, and we're happy to hear that the baby's not ugly. So
Yes, we like pretty babies, so it's good.
And this baby was kind of sitting in your womb throughout the COVID times. You guys have been nurturing this baby for a while. Tell me a little bit about what gave you the inspiration to put this beautiful thing together.
you want me to start, Beth?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So the gestation for this book was actually probably a decade,
Wow.
because the initial idea for Shared Sisterhood came about through a professional association where we just had the term. And I was charged with developing it and creating it and figuring out what the components were, as we academics like to talk about it. But I started writing this, and what I really wanted to ask myself, or the question I wanted to answer, was, well, if feminism is real, why aren't Black and white women helping each other in the workplace? I never understood the separate lunches, the different kind of networks. It felt like there was always this chasm separating us. And I'm married to a historian. And so there are all these history books, and I started reading about the history of the workplace and the labor force, and realizing that one of the critical issues or things that was missing was trust. There was no trust
Mm.
between women of different racial ethnic backgrounds, and I focused on Black and white women. I'm a Black white woman, and in the United States, the predominant racial ethnic group is white people. So I was curious about that, and so I tried to write a white paper, and it just didn't get any traction. And then I realized if I was going to write about how we can come together as women across difference, I needed to write it with someone who was different than me. And that's where Beth came in. Beth, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, Tina and I had been working together on various projects and known each other for quite a while. And I remember one day I said, well, what else are you thinking about? We had been talking about issues. And she sent me this draft of this white paper. And she was like, I've been thinking about it for years. And where can I go with this? And it was called Shared Sisterhood. And we started talking about this. I loved it from the moment. We talked about it, as a white woman. Tina and I share so many different identities as mothers, wives, professors. But one of the biggest identities that we don't share is our race. And here in the United States, that identity has a lot of salience. And with the background that I had and the interests that I had, it was something that was very important to me. How can we come together to actually achieve equity at work? How can we bridge these differences that are very real and very apparent? And we all know that they exist, and we all have various levels of motivation to want to traverse them. And so at that point, Tina and I started to think about this and doing what academics do, which is, well, let's gather some data. Let's do some thinking. Let's do some talking. Let's do some theorizing. And then the summer of 2020 occurred, right? And there were so much Black trauma and death that was just permeating our entire culture in the United States. And Tina started to get a lot of requests from companies saying, what can we do? What can we say? And Tina and I, at that point in time, it was the time for the book is now. And we knew we needed to accelerate that to get it out into the world to say, well, people need a solution. We're tired of waiting for other people to come up with it. And so Tina and I developed our own.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I think what I love to point out is you even started it out in the preface of your book. You wrote, "Can Black women and white women be true friends?" I love just asking that question to begin with. And one of the things I wanted to start with, Tina, in your preface, you were talking about how you actually had a lot of trouble identifying with the term feminist at one point. And I think that's such an important point to this conversation and such a fascinating perspective. So share a little bit more with me about why that term bothered you so much.
Yes. So the term feminist, I never identified with it when I was in high school and college. And, I went to graduate school, and I tell a story in the book about being at a graduate women in business meeting, and predominantly white women were there, and then there was me. And we were talking about the need for feminism in the graduate school and how we needed to have more women professors. And so I raised my hand and said something like, well, that's cool. One way to address this is to also address the fact that I think at the time there was one tenure track Black woman professor, but that issue was quickly subordinated. It was felt to be a distraction. And so for that reason, and also because of the very troubling history of the feminist movement and the suffrage movement, I mean, for your listeners, it's a great thing, right, to have the right to vote. Many people talk about how that happened. But Black women didn't actually have the right to vote till the 1960s. So it was far after some of the celebrations and victories that are lauded as being associated with the feminist or the suffrage movement. So therein lies why it was difficult for me to identify. I felt that the feminist movement wanted me to ignore the fact that I am a Black woman. And you cannot disentangle those things. My experience of being Black is through the lens of being a woman. My experience of being a woman is through the lens of being Black. And so whenever there are organizations or movements that I feel want me to mute critical aspects of myself, it's challenging. It's very challenging. So that is a longer answer, hopefully, to why the term feminist has been challenging me. Now, I consider myself to have reclaimed that term. I'm like, this is what a feminist looks like. So I'm a feminist. And if you have a problem with having an intersectional lens, then, well, that's more your issue than mine.
I think that's such an important point, and I was so grateful to read that perspective, something that myself as a white woman had no idea would be an uncomfortable, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I definitely can recognize that. And I also think that, one of the strengths of this book is having, as you mentioned, the perspective of a Black woman and a white woman, and especially with the title Shared Sisterhood. This is the importance, is to not only understand what we do share and what we don't.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the key lenses that we're trying to take here, which is it's not just about what you feel in your heart. It's not just about how you think about the world. It's how you relate to other people. And that key component, that interpersonal component, we felt was missing from so many approaches to inclusion at work and belonging at work,
Mhm.
which is, well, how are we treating each other interpersonally? How are we coming together across these sometimes huge chasms, not just small differences in the way in which we're experiencing the world? And we wanted to really focus on that, on how we can have these authentic connections that are built on something real. And we felt like that was the linchpin for how we're going to actually start to build equity in the workplace.
Yeah, and Beth, you said that so eloquently in the book, and I highlighted that as well because it rung true with me. You said, "I learned that racism was not just an individual challenge that one person's love could overcome."
Mm.
Because I think that sometimes we want to say, "But I love everyone, but I want to love everyone, but that's what I know about myself." But digging a little bit deeper, it required consistent effort to dig, and you guys explain what dig means to you later on in the book, my own preconceptions that may perpetuate inequity in ways I didn't even intend.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That that in,
beautifully said.
yeah, that intent versus impact. Tina and I talk so much about that just in our own life. I mean,
Mhm.
we talk about this when we're looking at issues that are coming up. I feel like every day there's a new issue of inequity that we have to
Yeah.
talk about, and we're all often talking about intent versus impact. And
Mm,
often when we're thinking about our own actions, we're focusing on our intent. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't
right.
mean to make you feel that way. I care about you. I love you. But sometimes we need to take a step back and say, well, what's our impact? And we need to recognize that people's hurt is real, even if we didn't intend for it to happen.
Mm,
And where I often, when I talk to people and I talk to companies about this, and I often say, your intent matters because it dictates what you're going to do next, what you're going
Mhm.
to do to make it right. Right. And that's where your intent matters. It doesn't erase the harm that happened because of what you did or didn't do. What it says is, well, your intent matters because it means you're not going to do it again. You're going to actually learn and grow. And I think we have to be able to reckon with both of those things, that sometimes people with good intentions and good hearts screw up. But if you really have good intentions and good hearts, it means you're going to do the work to make sure you don't do it again. And I think that's where a lot of people slip up, is they don't take that extra step.
And
beautiful.
I wanted to say, I mean, what Beth is describing, what I'm describing, what shared sisterhood is about, it's important that people understand this is different than friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Because many people are like, well, I want to be friends with everyone. Well, you can be friends with someone and never talk about power dynamics and talk about the way that things are structured in our society. So, shared sisterhood really centers the value of equity. And I know there are some people who are saying, wait a minute, what does equity even mean? What does equality mean? And equity is about redressing the systems that have led to disparate outcomes and disparate processes in some instances in the workplace. And I do want to say it does not mean that everyone gets everything. Some people will hear this and say, well, what about merit? What about qualifications? This in no way is saying that people who have less merit, for example, objectively should be just given things that others have not earned. And but I'm talking around an issue that just came up, and you may have to edit this out,
Mhm.
Taryn, but it just came up in our field where people are attacking the very notion and the need for equity and for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're holding this up as somehow oppositional to this idea of truth. They're saying, well, and academics should pursue the truth. We shouldn't pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what if those things are complementary?
Yeah.
What if those things inform each other? And so I think it's very important that we're clear about how we're defining things and what we're labeling things. Beth and I are not saying, okay, anyone who is Black or a woman. I mean, imagine, Taryn, if we just said, if someone said, Taryn, you want to promote any woman to be a podcast host. You'd say that's absurd. You need certain skills or training. But for some reason, when it comes to racial ethnicity, people are comfortable using that argument that we just want to dismiss ability and competence. And in fact, there are so many competent and able Black women, people of color. I would say just get out of the way and let us go for the job. And you'll see there's many more of us out there than what you have recognized.
I actually think it's a very relevant conversation, even in light of this audience and this episode, because within healthcare and within institutions who are actually educational institutions for
Yes.
dentistry and medicine, we see this all the time. And this
Yes.
argument comes up all the time. And especially, I think, as business owners who are seeking to establish equality, equity in our businesses,
Yes.
this is still a very relevant conversation. Something I wanted to touch base on is the sisterhood part as well, in terms of the feminine identity
Yes.
and superpowers in terms of leadership.
Yes.
And that's something you touched on in the book so beautifully. And one of the things we're talking about when we look back on ourselves to understand this conversation a little bit more is, and tell me if you agree, is compassion. You mentioned several leadership skills from a feminine perspective as opposed to like a very masculine perspective. So if the masculine are things like dominance and aggression and getting on top at the expense of others, and then those feminine traits of connection, as
Yeah.
you mentioned in the book. One of them that I see is compassion. In order for us to bridge this gap
Mhm.
and understand ourselves and our past in terms of racism and equity, is also having enormous compassion so that we can move forward. Do you
Mhm.
agree?
Yes, we talk about this. It's a really important component. And when we talk about bridges, which are these authentic connections with people who are different from you, we talk about them being characterized by four things. And I think compassion fits in there. So empathy, vulnerability, trust building, and taking risks on behalf of somebody else. And I think compassion fits really well in there because it means that you are seeing someone's full humanity, right? And you're respecting that and you are feeling an emotion related to that. And sometimes showing compassion means you have to also be vulnerable, make yourself vulnerable to feel things that are difficult to feel and to take steps that reflect the humanity of the person you have compassion for, which might entail risk taking. You have to stand up and ask for something, fight for something, take a stand on something because you have compassion for that person you're trying to interact with. So I do think that is a really important lens. But I also think it reflects something that Tina was talking about, which is when we talk about qualifications and we talk about merit, it's such an expansive, there's so many more expansive ways to think about these skills and these traits and these abilities that make someone good at what they do. And if you sat down and said, what does it mean to be a good nurse? Right there, or to be a good anesthesiologist, or to be a good entrepreneur, any of these sort of jobs, you could list a dozen things. And some of them would be about the specific tasks you do, and some would be about the specific person you want to hold that job. And you're thinking about who do you know who's been good at that before? And you are considering what those components are. And I would argue that we do a disservice if we don't think about things like compassion, because every one of us knows jobs that we went to that we would have loved doing the job, but the people, not so much. And so if we ignore those interpersonal skills, then I think we do ourselves a disservice to build these connections and to build more equity.
And I wanted to say two things. The first is about the language of feminine and masculine. So we are intentionally playing with stereotypes. So the feminine and masculine, if we want to label it that, all of us have those. We have elements of that as well. What Beth and I recognize in our book, and part of the reason why we use the term sisterhood, is because we're playing with the notions and the stereotypes around gender. Anyone can be a sister regardless of gender if you engage in those four things, the risk taking, the trust, the empathy, and the vulnerability. You are a sister. We wanted to challenge because, again, speaking about evaluation, part of the reason why you may say that some women in the past have been considered not as performing as well is because maybe they were being assessed on how aggressive they were,
Right.
or how assertive or how competitive they were. So the evaluation tools are critical. I think about in the medical field, this idea of compassion and how we're evaluating doctors. It might be sort of your bedside manner. That's one of the things that we consider. But one of the issues that came up for me when it came to racism in the medical field was this research which found that Black people are perceived as having a higher pain tolerance. And so think about that. We are saying that we have qualified medical professionals who have gone through medical school and their residencies, and they're now out there working with the public. But when they look at Black people, they think that they have a higher pain tolerance, which leads to all of these more negative outcomes. What if shared sisterhood had been in place? Because in order to break that down, if doctors had authentic connection with Black people, they would have been able probably to put that myth to bed much sooner. So shared sisterhood can actually save lives in that way. It can lead to better medical outcomes if you're developing those relationships where you can have those challenging conversations. And I'm sort of moving ahead to dig, but dig is about surfacing your assumptions about people who are similar to you, but who are different than you.
Yeah.
And one of the things that medical doctors may have been able to dig out, and nurses and others in the medical profession, is that we do think certain people have a higher pain tolerance, which, oh my God, it may actually inform how we medically treat them. People like Serena Williams almost dying from when she was pregnant. Sorry, Beth, you had your hand raised.
No, I was trying to turn my light back on because, I'm one of those wonderfully sustainable offices where the lights go out when you don't move a lot. And so, but we're fine. We're gonna set some mood lighting here. It's completely fine.
That's hilarious.
So,
yeah.
So going back to where you just left that, Tina, dig, which I'm going to share with our audience, is deep introspection and individual growth, as you define it, which is such a great, awesome way to think about this. And I just want to look at that in the lens of compassion here again, and actually, interestingly, self-compassion.
Yeah. Yes.
So as that doctor who has the courage to say, isn't that interesting? I think this whole time I had this misconception, or maybe I've been fed from society or from my people I admired in my life, the idea that Black people have a higher pain tolerance, giving yourself some compassion so that there is room to grow.
Yes.
Right? There's that very interesting aspect of, I thought differently. I have the courage to face it now, to take the lesson and leave the pain so that I can change my conversation, change my belief structure around this. So I think there's a lot to be said there in terms of not only using them externally, these beautiful skills that you've highlighted, but also turning them back in on ourselves so that we can grow further as leaders.
Yes. And I think I love how you put it with this sort of self-compassion. When Tina and I came up with Shared Sisterhood, when we started writing this book, I should say, we talked a lot about change and optimism for change. This is a radically optimistic book. Everybody can do this. And I think that is what we want people to understand. And to write an optimistic book, you have to believe in the power for people to change. And you have to believe that if people do the work, they can see the world differently. They can build better, stronger, more authentic connections. And that is why we talk about dig. We talk about, what happens when you run into a roadblock and you're like, I'm ashamed of something that I've thought or said or done, or I realize that I hurt someone in the past, and what do I do about that? We talk about apologies, and I think that is what we want people to understand is, if your intentions truly do reflect this value of equity, if those are truly what your intentions are, there's never a point in which you're done with the work. But that means that doesn't mean that it's hard necessarily and that it's painful, right? It can be joyous and beautiful too, because the end are these deep, authentic connections with people who will enrich your lives.
So good.
I also wanted to add the idea of grace. So we talk about this in the book, but it's something, so when you go back to the medical doctor who recognizes this pattern and then extends compassion to themselves, I think the members of the group or the community that have been harmed may rightfully be angry, may have all kinds of negative affect cognitions. But at some point, if we believe in things like restorative justice, if we believe in linking arms together and working together to pursue equity, there has to be some level of grace that is extended. Now, this is voluntary. No one can you need to be more gracious. Okay, that's not that's not being grace. That is something else. But I can use it as the relationship with Beth and I, we need to, when we make mistakes, if we believe that we're centering the value of equity, we will make mistakes in our time together. How can we extend grace to each other so that it can sort of lubricate the machinations of collective action? I think that's a critical point. And grace, I just mean unearned favor. It's like, you have made a mistake. I could really decimate you, but instead I'm going to extend my hand and work with you on this study or on this experience so that together we can get to a better place.
If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you didn't get into business to be miserable. The problem is that people feel that if their business gets busier, if they start becoming more successful, that happiness will eventually set in. But it can actually get worse. This is why I created the Business of Happiness Prosperity Coaching. In this one-on-one coaching, we look at how to redefine success on your terms and re-find the joy and the passion in your dream. Visit me at thebizofhappiness.com and become the happiest business owner you know. Yeah, and that fits really well into your risk-taking, actually, as well. I'm taking a risk here. And that's an important component of authentic connection that you mentioned in the book is risk-taking.
Yes.
Right? Being the empathy that we've been talking a lot about, the vulnerability being in connection with really identifying what is going on inside of you through your dig process. Trust, I want to skip over that for a minute because I have so much to say, but then also taking a risk in many ways. This is just one tiny little way, but tell me more about risk-taking and how you see risk-taking as an important concept of the sisterhood.
Risk-taking in general, I think, was when we were talking about this, it was pretty much the linchpin, I think, of something that we were like, it's absolutely necessary for us to understand authentic connections. And I think that reflects the need for us to talk a lot about actions and not just about thoughts and feelings, that we need to be moving from thinking and feeling to doing. And risk-taking is part of that. And we've been working on research to demonstrate the critical component of this, actually, and have found research evidence that this risk-taking is incredibly important, particularly from people from marginalized racial ethnic groups, to feel like they can build authentic connections, right? To say, you say you share my values, and I want to see that because I'm putting myself out here and I'm risking hurt, I'm risking sabotage, I'm risking all of these things to build a connection with you. And I want to know that you truly value me the way that you say you do. And risk-taking for me is part of that. And risks are different. So not every risk is going to be, well, I will, jump off a building, whatever, kind of big, huge risk you're talking about. Sometimes it's speaking up in meetings. Sometimes it's, Tina likes to talk a lot about amplification. So amplifying other people's voices in meetings. Sometimes it is, doing those small moments when no one's watching you to put yourself out there and to say something that you are uncomfortable doing. I'll give a brief example, and then I would love Tina to share a little bit about amplification and how that sort of fits in here too. It can be hard I'm a person, my personality, I don't know if it's what it's about my personality. I'm very conflict avoidant. Tina knows this about me. Like, I do not. She's laughing because we've had these conversations.
I'm not conflict avoidant. I mean, I don't seek conflict, but I definitely don't avoid it. Okay.
No, and I'm very conflict avoidant. And that can mean it's easier for me sometimes if I see something that is unfair or inequitable, I could possibly have more of a tendency to not say anything and reach out behind. I'm good with empathy, right? That's something I think that I listen well. I could reach out behind the scenes. But if I really want to build an authentic connection, if I want to demonstrate that trust building, I can't always say things quietly and not say things publicly. I have to make myself uncomfortable, and I have to stand up and say, no, don't say that in front of me, or we need to talk about why those assumptions are the way that they are in the moment. And I can't wait until afterwards all the time to do that. And those are important sort of things, even if these things are hard for you, particularly if they're hard for you, they're things you need to engage in. Tina?
Yeah.
From the lens of allyship,
Yeah.
you're saying. Yeah.
Because it's about action, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a great segue because the risk-taking component is crucial. Because I think most people perceive of themselves as being good people, concerned about equity and fairness and justice. And yet, when you observe something in the workplace or in the operating theater or in the medical school, and it's just not right, will you take a risk and actually speak up? Because what we have is potentially two values that are coming in conflict. You have some people, you want harmony, in the workplace. But then you have an issue, a value of inequity, or something of inequity happening. Those two things are in opposition. And one of the things that we notice is that, unfortunately, many people from power dominant groups, whether that be men or white people or Christian people, as I am, when they tend to notice this value conflict, they may err on the side of harmony. I don't want to say anything. They don't want to take the risk of being disliked, of maybe getting fired. Without that, though, we can't actually affect change. If no one is willing to take a risk, and unfortunately, the risk is often borne by people from historically marginalized groups. So Black people, Latinx people, gay people, Muslim people, people in the United States who have historically been marginalized. That is something that is not sustainable. We have got to have people who are by God, you're from a power dominant collective. You have some power, you have some political capital. Use it. If you believe in equity, use your own status to pursue it.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. You used a really beautiful example of this later in the book that was actually talking about when we were talking about roadblocks, but you were talking about Glennon Doyle's when she was asked to speak on a panel as a white woman about inclusion of Black women. And could you tell us a little bit about that story? I don't want to summarize here. Tina, tell us a little bit about that story from the lens of risk taking.
I'm actually gonna, because Beth is the one who suggested this Glennon Doyle story, and one of the things that I love about the relationship and the friendship and sisterhood we have is we dap each other up and elevate each other. And I want to give credit where credit is due. Beth is the one who initially suggested this, and so Beth, why don't you explain?
I was really struck by this, and part of this, I was struck by Glennon Doyle's willingness to make herself vulnerable and to share her process, because it's so important for us to see it. You can see someone, and I'm going to explain a little bit of what happened here in just a moment, but just as a kind of overarching thing, you can see people who have rich relationships like I have with Tina, for instance, and you can say, oh, well, it must have been easy for you, right? These sort of situations. And you can misunderstand the work that goes into making yourself trustworthy to building these sort of relationships. And so when Glennon was invited to speak at this, anti-racism event, she agreed. Of course, I'm going to volunteer my time. I'm going to do this. I have a big platform. I'm going to speak to white women. And she was asked by women of color who are running this event to do this. And, the next day had a lot of negative feedback about her sort of taking her stamping up in a spotlight when she could have been elevating women of color, for instance, who are already doing this work, which she hadn't thought about, right? That hadn't dawned on her that it might be interpreted this way. And at first, she had choices to make in that moment. You can get defensive and say, well, my heart says this, my intentions are this. Why can't you see what my intentions are? Right. But if your goal is equity, and hers is, if your values are relational as hers are, you listen and you grow. And that's what she did. And I think that's what and she posted her process, and she wrote about it in depth in the book, which is, how horrible it feels for people to say you're racist. But if that's the worst thing you're worried about, let's have some perspective, right, about what it means to actually be the target of racism versus being labeled a racist, and what that actually means. Because if you're not, right, if you say, no, I'm not, then you reflect on why people might see you that way. And you say, how can I begin to repair that perception of myself? Not out of a feeling of this fundamental guilt, but out of a responsibility and a desire to connect, that relational desire. And that's what she reflected on. I thought it was such a brilliant way to say, yeah, I'm going to screw up, but I'm going to constantly try to do better, because we're all drinking in this water of bias and racism and prejudice. And if you don't spit it out, right, then how are you actually working to make change? And I thought it was a wonderful demonstration for white women like myself to say, yeah, you're going to screw up, but what next?
Yeah, and I want to talk about this whole notion of white guilt and why it's so harmful, because this is not white people, white women, Glennon Doyle. You could sit in the fact, oh my gosh, I feel so bad. I have all these negative thoughts and emotions, but it's paralyzing.
Yeah.
We don't want guilt. We want conviction, meaning you acknowledge this thing, you're aware of this thing, and you use that to motivate change going forward.
We don't want paralysis.
Yeah, we don't want paralysis, and we don't. It's not about making someone feel bad about themselves. It's about being honest about what has transpired, what your role was in it, and then collaborating with people who have been harmed by your behavior or by the behavior of a collective of which you're a member. I talk about this a lot because I think it's really important for people to recognize. All of us have multiple identities. We have overlapping identities. I have said I'm a Black Christian woman. Those three are many more things, but Christian, at least in the United States, is a power dominant religious group. And people may deny that, but if you don't think it's true, just look at your organizational calendar. And what are the holidays that are a given? It's usually Christmas, for example, but there are things like the Festival of Lights, Diwali, or those typically have not historically been holidays that have been granted off. So that means that I'm power dominant in that way. Christian people have had access to and control over resources, but I'm also from historically marginalized groups, Black and women, which this is a group that's had historically less access to and control over those resources. So it's not about me feeling bad as a Christian. It's about me saying, how can I acknowledge the harm that this collective of which I'm a member has done so that it never happens again? And being from these other historically marginalized groups probably gives me a lens to understand that. And there's power in that recognition because it can lead to conviction.
And I think you mentioned this so beautifully in the book that these 4 components of authentic connection don't live as islands.
Right.
They're so important to integrate in one another. And that actually came up as you were speaking about each of these: empathy, vulnerability, trust, and risk taking. They can't live alone. In taking that risk, we're being vulnerable, and in taking the risk, maybe our fears come true and we do get backlash.
Yep.
Well, that's where the empathy needs to come in again, right?
Yes.
And it's such a fascinating web that actually these 4 really support one another. I love how you mentioned that in the book. I do want to touch on, because we glossed right over it, this idea of trust. And the reason why I think that's such a great conversation in the lens of my audience is because we know as medical care professionals that I can't have the impact on your health and on your healing without it. It's one of those key components. If my patient loses trust in me, if I lose trust in my team, if I lose trust in my patient, then things really break down. And I think it's such a key aspect of healing and growth. So, Tina, tell me a little bit about, in terms of trust from the lens of shared sisterhood.
Yes. I mean, trust is about, do you believe that the other person has your best interest at heart? And at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned how when I thought about feminism, I realized that there was a lack of trust between Black women and white women. I think, unfortunately, in our current society, speaking in the medical field, I think there may be an increasing lack of mistrust between patients and medical providers for any number of reasons, from insurance to just costs, et cetera, and also racism and stereotypes.
And accessibility.
And
Yes.
I mean, there's so many disparate outcomes, and COVID really brought all of that to a head. When I think about trust, though, you can't demand that someone trusts you.
No.
Trust is earned. Trust is earned. And it's important that the people who have been harmed, or the people who are potentially from these historically marginalized groups, that people from power dominant groups recognize that you have to earn that trust. And so we're not entering into this conversation at the same point. And so Beth and I have a story about how we met, how I was a little resistant and I didn't trust Beth. Beth could sense that. So Beth persisted to build the trust because she felt that a relationship with me, and it might sound obnoxious for me to say it, but she has said before that a relationship with me was worth it.
Yeah.
And once she had my trust, now we can really do the work. We can bridge, we can connect. And that's the same thing. You have to be willing. Somebody has to be willing to take the first step to establishing and demonstrating that you have the other person's best interest at heart. And we can go into the details of how Beth and I did that. But in the medical field, do you take time with all of your patients? Do you smile at them? Are you on time? If you're going to be late, do you give them an outlet? If they're late for a meeting, do they get charged $100? But if you're late for the meeting, they're just expected to stay. There are so many different practices that I've experienced as a patient, as a person, where my doctor now, she gets me. She understands me. She cares for me. She often doesn't even have on her medical thing. She's talking to me. It sometimes feels like I'm talking to a girlfriend. She's really working to demonstrate that she cares for me and she sees my full humanity. That, I think, is so important when it comes to trust.
And I think you make a really good point there that, these things you start slow. You don't zoom to intimacy, right? We want to sometimes, right? Like we want to be able to well, I have good intentions, just trust me. Like,
Yeah.
why aren't you trusting me? And, that's a hard thing when I wanted to start with the benefit of the doubt, start with trust with Tina. Like, just trust me. Like, why wouldn't you trust me? Instead of working from those small moments and recognizing that we're starting from different places, like Tina said. And that's true with your patients. You don't know how many times they've been harmed by medical care providers or the medical care system or whatever. No matter what your intentions are as a provider, you don't know that about this person. And so you tread softly to establish these small moments of trust, these small indicators that you're seeing their full humanity, that you're listening, you're showing empathy, you're demonstrating your vulnerability. And sometimes that means taking risks on their behalf, which is like, okay, I'm going to take the risk of perhaps I'm wrong, right? Maybe I'm wrong. And let me just listen for a moment and let me try to build that relationship up because you believe it's worth it. Because you believe not only just the connection and, enhances your day. It's a high quality connection. You leave the room feeling better, which is valuable. We should all know that in the wake of COVID, that if you can have even small micro moments of positivity, like hold on to them. But you also they'll be more likely to trust you when you do have to tell them hard things, when you do have to have them, you hear all the time in the medical field about the word compliance, right? Are they compliant? Are they compliant? And I would challenge, and obviously this may be easier for me to say being outside of the medical field, for us to rethink that word. Right. And maybe perhaps instead of compliant patients, we talk about trusting patients, patients who trust us because we've earned their trust. And, maybe if we shift our thinking that way and we start to say, well, maybe they're not compliant for a reason that makes sense to them. And maybe we can build trust by listening and being vulnerable to the fact that we may be wrong. And I think that goes a long way.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. Oh my gosh, I have 754 more questions for you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with both of you today. I am just so excited. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing some of your insight. And, I just want to really applaud this incredible book. I think it sparked for me so many introspective questions. We didn't even get to really the meat of the book, which was how to really incorporate this in beyond ourselves, right? Interpersonally, and then in terms of institutions, which you outline so beautifully in the book. So please, all of my listeners, if this has sparked a question in you or any desire, please reach out and get this book. And Beth, we're going to leave a link to this book in the show notes so that people can access it readily. But if you could just tell us, for any of our audience members who are listening to this podcast right now, can you just speak for us where to find the book?
Shared Sisterhood is available at all your favorite book retailers. So you can just search Shared Sisterhood at any of those search bars on any of those retailers and it will pop up. And you can also find links to them at Tina and I's, both of our websites. So at BethALivingston.com or at drtinaopie.com. And you can find links to all your favorite retailers there. And we hope that you love it as much as we loved creating it.
And we get to hear you in person, if we like, on your book tour.
Yes.
So there's some exciting upcoming events. Tina, where are you speaking next?
So I am speaking on Wednesday, October 12th at Twigo Groundbreakers, where I am honored to be taking the stage with the iconic Gloria Steinem. We'll be
Stop it.
I know, right? I'm like, yes, Mama, I made it. So we will be talking about shared sisterhood and her book about being on the road, and really sort of some of the future ideas for feminism, for equity, and for just creating a better world. And then Beth, I know you're going to be talking at some places.
So I'm actually speaking October 3rd. But that will for the Iowa City Book Festival. Iowa City is a UNESCO City of Literature, and so here in Iowa City we celebrate all types of literary achievements. But it will be available on the Iowa City Library's website. So all of the links to and our events will be, you can go to our websites and we'll be sharing our events coming up. And if you want to talk to us more, you can reach out to us via our websites and our contacts as well, because we'd love to hear from you about events in your organization or your town that you would like for us to come and do.
Now, Beth, one clarification. You said October 3rd. That's today.
Yes. Well, whenever this is posted, but it will be in the past, so you can go and review my talk on
But the Iowa City Book Festival is happening when?
today.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Oh, it is. Oh my
I
gosh.
didn't
Okay.
realize it was happening today. I was like,
Yes.
I thought it was, okay, correct.
I know. It comes up
that out,
fast.
Tarryn.
Time is a circle. We don't know what day it is. We're just moving and
do not.
grooving and are so excited to talk to you, Tarryn.
know, thank
It's
you.
awesome. I'm grateful for this moment in time, every moment. And before we leave, I'd love to know from both of you, please. I ask this of all of my guests, and I think it's always so insightful to our own understanding. But Beth and then Tina, I'd love to know, what is your definition of happiness?
My definition of happiness, well, that's a wonderful and very in-depth question. But I would say that my definition of happiness is being secure in who I am and in my relationships with other people.
Beautiful. So good.
And I would say my definition of happiness, which I do distinguish from joy, is when I am feeling pleasant, content, typically with the people around me and with myself.
Beautiful. Thank you both. Thank you both for your vulnerability, for your expertise, for your risk-taking, for your empathy, and for the trust that you have in us in delivering us this beautiful book. And I wish you the best of luck. And thank you so much for sharing everything with us here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tarryn. Thank you.